Did
Did
anyone
anyone
call
for him?
The question settled over the funeral parlor like the scent of lilies. Heavy, inescapable, suffocating. The undertaker's headshake was almost imperceptible. No. Not even once. 3 people occupied the room: the undertaker, a neighbor clutching wet tissues, and a silence that had arrived decades too late. Because the children had finally come. Just not when it mattered. Outside, rain applauded against the roof. Persistent, mocking. Inside, the polished casket gleamed under fluorescent lights, cradling a man who'd spent his last years waiting for a phone to ring. Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward, her voice cracking the stillness. "He loved you," she whispered toward the well-dressed strangers. "Let me tell you what that looked like. And why he believed his phone was broken." Welcome to Nature Shot Tales. Before we begin, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. These stories touch hearts worldwide. Let's see how far we reach today. Now, let's begin. The funeral parlor smelled of wilting lilies and rain-soaked wool. It was a scent that clung to the back of the throat, sweet and suffocating, like grief itself. The room was vast, designed for crowds. Today it held only 5 souls: the undertaker, Mrs. Alvarez clutching a damp tissue, and 3 well-dressed strangers who happened to be the dead man's children. Daniel checked his watch. Sarah adjusted her pearl necklace. Michael scrolled through his phone with the volume off, his thumb moving in practiced, mindless swipes. They stood around the mahogany casket like diplomats at a state function, present but not participating, grieving but not broken. Outside, rain drummed against stained glass windows in a rhythm that felt like reluctant applause. Inside, the man in the casket lay with his hands folded, his face smoothed of the worry lines that had defined his final years. He looked smaller than he had in life, as if dying had taken up physical space. The children whispered, "I have a flight at 6. I rescheduled 2 depositions for this. Do we know who's handling the estate?" Mrs. Alvarez turned her head sharply, her jaw tightening. The undertaker pretended not to hear, his face a practiced mask of sympathy that barely concealed judgment. There was a time when this man's house never knew silence. 42 years ago, the house on Maple Street wasn't a house at all, just a plot of dirt and a promise scrawled on a napkin. Arthur was 26 then, newly married, with shoulders broadened by 12-hour shifts at the Riverside Steel Mill. The heat from the blast furnaces left permanent red marks on his forearms, and the dust turned his lungs gray long before his hair followed. He didn't buy the house. He built it. Not metaphorically. Not by signing checks to contractors in air-conditioned offices. Brick by brick. After his shift ended at 6 p.m., he would come home, wolf down the sandwich Margaret had wrapped in wax paper, and walk out to the lot. Under the harsh glare of rented floodlights, he would lay mortar and hoist beams until his neighbors' televisions went dark and the street lamps buzzed alone. His hands were perpetually gray with cement dust. His knuckles bled. His back ached in ways that would never fully heal. "Come inside, Arthur," Margaret would call from the trailer they rented. "You'll work yourself into the grave before you finish." He would wipe his forehead with a rag, spit into the dirt, and pick up the trowel again. "It's for the children," he'd say, his voice hoarse. "They need walls that won't crack. A roof that won't leak when the storms come." He wasn't a man of poetry. He didn't know how to name the fierce, wordless love that burned in his chest when he looked at his infant son sleeping in a cardboard bassinet. So he loved in action. He loved in the extra overtime shifts that paid school fees before the second notice arrived. He loved in uniforms ironed at 5 a.m., creases sharp enough to cut. He loved in lunch money folded into small palms with a firm nod that said, "You are covered. You are safe." Margaret was the warmth of the house. Arthur was the foundation. She remembered birthdays and baked cookies shaped like stars. He remembered oil changes and property taxes and replaced the furnace filter every October without fail. Together, they were balance. The years folded quietly, one into the next. The children grew. Muddy sneakers became cleats, then dress shoes, then carry-on luggage. Arthur pushed them. Not with his voice, he rarely raised it, but with expectation, a gravity that bent their lives toward achievement. "Make something of yourself," he would say at dinner, his fork resting on the table. "Go further than I ever could. Don't let the dirt settle on your shoes." And they obeyed. Daniel had his father's discipline and his mother's charm. He became a corporate executive, moving to a city of glass towers where he managed budgets larger than Arthur's lifetime earnings. Sarah had steady hands and a sharp mind. She became a surgeon, her calendar a jigsaw puzzle of on-call shifts and medical conferences in cities Arthur couldn't pronounce. Michael, the youngest, inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's smile. He became a financial consultant, flying between time zones. His life lived in airport lounges and hotel bars. Arthur wore their success like medals. At the barbershop, he would pull laminated photos from his wallet, tapping them with a thick, calloused finger. "My son, the executive. My daughter, the doctor. My boy, the consultant." The barber would nod. The other men would murmur approval. Arthur would smile, his chest swelling with a pride so large it left no room for the quiet ache of absence. He thought their wings were the reward. He didn't realize that in building them so strong, he had ensured they would fly too far to return. The silence arrived on a Tuesday morning in November. Arthur woke at 6 a.m., as he had for 40 years. The room was still dark, the world outside caught between night and dawn. He reached across the bed to touch Margaret's shoulder, to gently wake her for coffee. Her skin was cool. Not cold. Not yet. Just absent of warmth. "Margaret." He said it softly, as if volume might shatter something fragile. No response. He shook her gently. Her head lolled. "Margaret." Louder now. Panic threading through his voice. He fumbled for the phone. His hand shook so badly he misdialed twice before the operator answered. The paramedics arrived without sirens. They moved slowly, with the respectful efficiency of people who knew there was no emergency left to address. At the hospital, a young doctor with kind eyes and a clipboard delivered the news in a voice softened by repetition. "It was peaceful, Mr. Brennan." Her heart just stopped. No pain. She went in her sleep. Arthur nodded. He didn't cry. Not then. Crying required air, and he had forgotten how to breathe. Margaret's funeral was standing room only. The church overflowed with neighbors, co-workers, book club members, and people Arthur didn't recognize but who had been touched by his wife's quiet kindness. The children flew in from 3 different cities. They stood beside him at the graveside, a wall of black fabric and red eyes. Sarah gripped his hand. "We'll visit more, Dad. I promise." Daniel squeezed his shoulder. "You won't be alone. We'll set up a schedule. Weekly calls." Michael's voice cracked. "You have us. Always." Arthur nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He believed them. Why wouldn't he? He had built their lives with his own hands. After the burial, the house on Maple Street filled with people. Casseroles covered the kitchen counter. Laughter, subdued, respectful, briefly chased the shadows from the corners. For one afternoon, the house remembered what it used to be. But by evening, the flights were boarding. The meetings were waiting. "We'll call Sunday, Dad." One by one, the cars pulled away. Headlights swept across the living room and vanished down the street. Arthur stood in the doorway, watching the taillights fade. He closed the door, the oak door he had hung himself 30 years prior. The latch clicked, final and hollow. The house exhaled into silence. Arthur walked into the kitchen. Out of habit, 40 years of muscle memory, he opened the cupboard. He took out 2 plates. He set one at the head of the table. He set the second to his right. 2 forks. 2 knives. 2 folded napkins. He sat down and stared at the empty chair. For the first time, the man who had built everything realized he was living in a monument to people who were no longer there. The first Sunday after Margaret's funeral, Arthur woke at dawn and made coffee for 2 before remembering. He poured the second cup down the sink and sat at the kitchen table, his phone centered on the placemat Margaret had embroidered with yellow daisies. The screen was dark, reflective, showing him a distorted version of his own face. At 10 a.m., he dialed Daniel's number. 4 rings. Then voicemail. Arthur's throat tightened. He didn't leave a message. Daniel was busy. He would call back. At noon, he tried Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright but strained. "Hi, Dad. How are you?" Listen, I'm so glad you called, but I'm literally scrubbing in. Can I call you back tonight?" "Of course. I just wanted." The line went dead. She didn't call that night. On Monday, he texted Michael, "Hope you're well. Would love to hear your voice." The message showed delivered immediately. Then read 2 minutes later. No response came. The Sundays became a ritual of diminishing returns. Week 2. Daniel answered, breathless. "Dad, hey, I'm in the middle of a presentation. Can I call you tomorrow?" Tomorrow never came. Week 3. Sarah sent a text at 11 p.m. "Crazy day. 14-hour surgery. We'll call this weekend. Promise." The weekend passed in silence. Week 4. Michael's phone rang endlessly, each ring hollowing out Arthur's chest a little more. He began making excuses aloud, as if Margaret were still there to nod in agreement. Daniel's managing that acquisition. He mentioned it at the funeral. Sarah's saving lives. You can't pause a heart transplant for small talk. Michael's probably overseas. Time zones. But the excuses grew thin, threadbare, until he could see through them to the truth underneath. By the 3rd month, the calls stopped entirely. Arthur would send texts into the void. "Thinking of you today. Made your mother's pot roast. Doesn't taste quite right. The maple tree out front is changing colors." Each message was delivered. Each was read. The blue checkmarks mocked him with their confirmation. Seen, acknowledged, dismissed. He would sit at the table, phone in hand, staring at the screen as if concentration alone could summon a reply. The house was so quiet he could hear the refrigerator's hum, the tick of the hallway clock, the creak of floorboards settling like old bones. Loneliness, he discovered, wasn't silent at all. It roared. 3 months and 4 days after Margaret's funeral, Arthur put on his jacket and walked to the phone repair shop on 7th Street. It was wedged between a laundromat and a pawn shop, the kind of place with a flickering neon sign and a bell that chimed when the door opened. A young technician looked up from a disassembled tablet. He had kind eyes and hands stained with soldering flux. "Good afternoon, sir. What can I do for you?" Arthur approached the counter slowly, cradling his phone in both palms like something fragile. "I think something's wrong with it," he said quietly. The technician set down his tools. "What's the issue?" Arthur hesitated. The words felt foolish, but he'd rehearsed them on the walk over. "My children, they used to call. Every week. But now." He placed the phone gently on the counter. "Nothing. No calls. No messages. I thought maybe it's not receiving them." The young man's expression shifted. Something painful flickered across his face. He picked up the phone, turned it over, checked the settings with practiced fingers. Signal, full bars. Notifications, enabled. Software, up to date. He ran a diagnostic. Everything came back green. He set the phone down carefully and met Arthur's eyes. "There's nothing wrong with it, sir. It's working perfectly." Arthur's hands gripped the counter edge. His knuckles whitened. "Are you sure? Maybe something inside is broken? Something you can't see from the outside." The technician's throat worked. He looked at this old man, at the hope and desperation carved into the lines of his face, and felt something crack inside his own chest. "No, sir," he whispered. "Everything inside works just fine." Arthur nodded slowly. He pulled out his wallet with trembling hands and paid for a screen cleaning he didn't need. "Thank you," he said. "I just needed to be certain." He walked out into the grey afternoon, holding proof that the silence wasn't a malfunction. It was a choice. Behind the counter, the technician sat motionless for 5 full minutes before he could pick up his tools again. Arthur's 78th birthday arrived on a Wednesday in March. He woke, showered, dressed, made his coffee, read the newspaper without absorbing a single word. At noon, he walked to the bakery on 5th and bought a single slice of vanilla cake. "Special occasion?" the girl behind the counter asked, smiling. "A birthday," he said. "Oh, wonderful. Big party planned." He paused. "My family's very busy. Important people." "I'm sure they'll call," she said cheerfully, handing him the bag. Back home, he placed the cake on a small plate. He found a birthday candle in the junk drawer, left over from some grandchild's visit years ago, and pressed it into the frosting. He struck a match. The flame wavered, casting a small circle of warmth. He sat at the table alone. The candle burned slowly, wax pooling at the base. He watched it, hands folded in his lap like a man at prayer. When it had burned halfway, he leaned forward and whispered to the empty kitchen, "It's okay. They are busy." He blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward and vanished. He ate the cake in mechanical bites that tasted like nothing at all. On the table beside the plate, his phone sat dark and silent. Mrs. Alvarez noticed the change first. She'd known Arthur since he'd poured the foundation for this house, had watched his children grow from toddlers to strangers in expensive suits. Now she watched him shrink. He moved slower, spoke less, sat longer on the porch, staring at the empty street. One January morning, she woke to find her driveway already shoveled, the snow piled neatly to the side. Through her window, she saw Arthur 2 houses down, just beginning his own. He always did hers first. She brought him soup on Thursdays. He would accept it with quiet gratitude and return the container washed, sometimes with a $5 bill folded inside that she always returned. "You should call your children," she suggested gently one afternoon. Arthur smiled, a thin, practiced expression. "They have important lives. And you don't." He looked past her toward the street, as if expecting headlights that never came. He didn't answer. One February morning, Arthur's curtains stayed closed. By evening, Mrs. Alvarez knocked. No answer. She peered through the mail slot. "Arthur." Silence. She called 911. The paramedics found him in his armchair by the window, the one that faced the street. His hands were folded in his lap. His face was calm, the worry lines smoothed away as if death had been a mercy. On the side table sat his phone. Screen dark. No missed calls. No unread messages. One paramedic picked it up, checking for emergency contacts. The screen lit up. Battery, 82%. He set it down gently, though it no longer mattered. The house on Maple Street, built brick by hands that had loved fiercely and quietly, stood silent. And the phone that had waited so long for a call that never came finally stopped waiting altogether. The funeral parlor returned to focus like a camera lens adjusting after a long blur. The children stood around the casket, their expensive clothes suddenly feeling like costumes. Daniel's Rolex caught the light. Sarah's pearls gleamed against her black dress. Michael's Italian leather shoes squeaked softly against the floor. They looked at each other across the polished wood that separated them from their father's body. "When was the last time you talked to him?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I thought you were calling him." "I texted," Michael said defensively. "Last month. Maybe February." "Texted," Sarah repeated, the word heavy with accusation. "I was busy," Daniel said. "The merger." "I was busy too," Sarah cut in. "We were all busy." Busy. The word hung in the air like smoke. Busy building portfolios. Busy saving other people's parents. Busy living the lives he'd sacrificed everything to give them. Too busy to dial 10 digits. Too busy to visit on Sundays. Too busy to notice the silence growing wider until it swallowed him whole. He understood, Michael said quietly, though his voice carried no conviction. He always said we had important lives. And he didn't. The voice came from behind them. They turned. Mrs. Alvarez stood near the back row, her hands clutching a worn tissue. Her eyes were red, but her gaze was steady, unflinching. She stepped forward. "I'd like to say something," Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice cutting through the thick silence. The undertaker nodded. The children shifted uncomfortably. She walked to the front and stood beside the casket, placing one weathered hand gently on the wood. "Arthur Brennan was not a perfect man," she began, her voice soft but weighted. But he was a faithful one. She looked at the children, each in turn. He shoveled my driveway every snowfall. Before his own. Before dawn. I'd wake up and it would already be done. Her voice cracked slightly. He brought me soup on Thursdays. Your mother's recipe. He'd apologized that it didn't taste quite right, but he kept trying. Week after week. Even after she was gone. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. He talked about you constantly, Mrs. Alvarez continued. My son, the executive. My daughter, the surgeon. My boy, the consultant. He was so proud. So proud it hurt to watch sometimes. She paused, gathering herself. He loved you in the only language he knew, sacrifice and service. He wasn't good with words. But his actions. She trailed off, her throat working. Daniel stared at the floor. Michael's hands trembled. Then Mrs. Alvarez delivered the words that shattered them. 3 months after your mother died, he went to a phone repair shop. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He thought something was wrong with his phone. Because you weren't calling. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. He asked the technician if maybe something inside was broken. Something you couldn't see from the outside. Her voice broke completely now. The boy told him the phone worked fine. Everything worked fine. Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal. He believed it was technical, Mrs. Alvarez said, tears streaming down her face. That's how much he wanted to believe in you. He couldn't accept that the silence was a choice. Daniel's knees buckled slightly. He gripped the pew. Michael turned away, his shoulders shaking. He never stopped loving you, she finished. He just stopped believing he deserved to be loved back. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Alvarez returned to her seat, leaving the children standing in the wreckage of their own making. After the service, after the condolences and the hollow promises to stay in touch, Daniel returned to the house on Maple Street alone. The key was under the ceramic frog by the door, where it had been for 30 years. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old coffee. Everything was neat, orderly, frozen in time like a museum of absence. Daniel walked through the room slowly. The kitchen table still had 2 placemats. The living room still had Margaret's reading chair positioned by the window. In the bedroom, on the nightstand beside the bed Arthur had slept in alone for years, Daniel found a small spiral notebook. He opened it. His breath caught. Page after page of handwritten entries. November 14th. Called Daniel. 10:32 a.m. Voicemail. Will try tomorrow. November 21st. Called Sarah. 2:15 p.m. Said she'd call back. Didn't. November 28th. Texted Michael. Read 2:47 p.m. No response. December 5th. Called Daniel. Busy. Understood. December 12th. Called Sarah. Busy. Understood. December 19th. Called Michael. No answer. The entries continued. Weeks became months. The handwriting grew shakier, smaller, as if he were trying to take up less space even on paper. Daniel flipped to the last page, dated 3 weeks before his father's death. The entry was brief. Maybe I should stop calling. I don't want to disturb them. They have important lives. I'm proud of them. I just miss them. Beneath it, in trembling script, Margaret would know what to do. Daniel's legs gave out. He sank to the floor, the notebook clutched against his chest, and sobbed in a way he hadn't since childhood. They buried Arthur beside Margaret in Riverside Cemetery under a sky the color of old bruises. The headstones were simple, matching. Margaret Brennan. Beloved wife and mother. Arthur Brennan. Beloved husband and father. The children stood at the grave's edge as the casket was lowered. The mechanism whirred. Dirt scattered across polished wood. When it was done, when the workers had stepped back and the priest had offered final words, the 3 of them remained. The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the plastic flowers on nearby graves. Michael stepped forward, his voice barely audible. We should visit more often. The wind answered with silence. No forgiveness. No absolution. Just the indifferent rustle of leaves and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Sarah placed a bouquet of lilies, his favorite, on the fresh earth. Daniel stood frozen, the notebook still in his jacket pocket, a ledger of failure he would carry for the rest of his life. They walked away eventually, because that's what the living do. Behind them, the graves remained. Side by side. Together again. That night, the house on Maple Street sat dark. In the living room, on the side table beside the armchair that still held the shape of Arthur's body, his phone remained. Charged. Functional. Screen dark. Waiting for a call that would never come. Waiting for hands that would never pick it up. The battery indicator glowed faintly in the darkness, 82%. Outside, the wind moved through the maple tree Arthur had planted the year Daniel was born. Its branches scraped against the window like fingers asking to be let in. But the house was empty now. Graves don't ring. Phones don't light up for the dead. And regret, no matter how heavy, how sincere, how soul-crushing, doesn't rewind time. Arthur Brennan had given his children everything while he was alive. And they remembered him only when he could no longer answer. The phone's screen stayed dark. The house stayed silent. And the maple tree kept growing, indifferent to the emptiness inside the walls Arthur had built brick by brick, with hands that had loved fiercely in the only language they knew. But love unexpressed becomes absence. And absence, repeated long enough, becomes a grave. Some people don't die from age. They fade from neglect. Call your parents. Visit while they can still answer. Because apologies whispered into the ground. Arrive too late. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories that make you feel deeply. Hit the bell so you never miss one. Thank you for watching. Remember, call your parents. I'll see you in the next story.